and I want to say a big thank you to Lakshmi for giving me this chance. And Lakshmi, as many of you know her, is just absolutely amazing, and I adore her, and I will never say no to her for anything. So thank you for this opportunity. And it is a real privilege to be chatting with you today. When I was doing my research on you, one of the things that stood out is you have said that a liberal arts education is one of the greatest gifts American culture has given to the world. And I'm a product of a US liberal arts education myself. And as a journalist, of course, I'm not supposed to take sides, but yes, you're absolutely right. And I knew right away we were aligned on so many things and believe in many of the same causes. But again, it is a real privilege to talk to you. I wanted to begin by saying you are described regularly as an academic and author, president, and poet. If you had to describe yourself, which words would you use?
I would use driven, anxious, and inspired. Those three words.
Why anxious?
Anxious because if you're a college president or an academic institution president, Middlebury is in this really interesting space where it is understood as a college, but it's also broader than that, it's bigger than that now. But you are, the way I phrase it is you're at the crosshairs and the crossroads of American political life.
Mm-hmm.
And the expectations on higher education of what we need to deliver and how we deliver it and to whom we deliver it have never been more intense. And so you're always feeling as if you're never quite getting it right. And most people who land in my positions, they're a weird mixture of being perfectionists in a certain way and loving people in another way. And so you're always feeling like you could do better, and that's a good thing in the end. I think that's part of what a liberal arts education, liberal arts and sciences is the term I use, gives you, is this sense of permanent restlessness and that discipline of self-improvement all the time. But it can be a bit overwhelming because when you're in a position where it's impossible to please anyone, any leadership position is like that, but at a tumultuous time, then that's where the anxiety comes from. Can you lead well? Can you lead in a way that calms people down rather than gets them more anxious? And so I do a lot of, I wanted to answer you honestly because that's more fun. Yes. And I think I also want to make sure that my presence is one that inspires people rather than makes people feel that they're in the presence of an authority. I hope that's also true. But that's why I say inspired. The thing that's so interesting about being the president of a liberal arts and sciences college is that you're surrounded by people who do things that you could never do, ever. The funny example is Middlebury is known in part for its winter sports.
Yes.
I grew up in New England. I adored Middlebury from my childhood onwards, left New England, and was lured back earlier than I thought because there was no way I was going to turn this opportunity down. But I have very weak ankles and poor balance, so I never learned how to skate, and I never learned how to ski. And so I said to the Middlebury folks, I said, would dog sled racing, would it do that? And they enthusiastically said yes. And so I've done it twice, and so it counts. But that's a silly example in a way. But you're surrounded by young people who are doing things that you've never even thought of doing, who are creating NGOs that connect migrant worker bus routes in Vermont. And you never thought of that, and of course you never would, but and are creating really interesting ways of purifying water in war zones. I mean, just incredible things. Yeah. And so you are inspired every day, and it's a deep privilege to be that inspired every day. And the driven thing is, I had a 9th grade yearbook graduation saying on my page that said, always take on more than you can possibly handle and you'll never do all you can do. And I just got back from co-leading a retreat of women college presidents, of which there are more and more.
Yes.
It's very exciting, and it was delightful. We were so collegial, and we did lightning rounds. I have this problem, what do you guys do? And it was really wonderful. And one of the things we shared was our childhood path to get into becoming college presidents. And I said that this was my ninth grade yearbook, and they said, ninth grade? You were doing that? And I said, yeah, I was a little driven,
So started then.
That started then.
You're the 17th president of Middlebury College, but the first woman president. And the college is 218 years old.
Yes.
Why did it take so long?
Such a great question. And no one's ever asked it that, right? They usually say, how does it feel? Or what do you bring? Right. So you totally get it. We feel like we were friends from a long time ago anyway, so if we do a little sister thing, you just forgive us.
Just join it?
Just join it, exactly. So it's a really interesting question. I think Middlebury was ready for a woman college president 40 years ago, in fact, anxious for it. I think that searches are capricious things. And I also think that there's something deeply powerful and effective. My two predecessors were both long-term Middlebury professors who then became administrators and had been there for decades before they became presidents. And so it really, I think, is a powerful thing to know the culture. And it's a very brave thing for a small, rural, prestigious liberal arts and sciences college to go outside. You're making a statement when you decide to move. And so I think the women in the professoriate in the 80s and 90s that were long-term at Middlebury weren't necessarily the ones who wanted to run a college. And so I think Middlebury, after my predecessor finished his term, said, not only we're going to go outside, but we're really going to do it this time. We're really going to have a woman. So I think that certainly it was for no lack of effort. I think in the end, that sort of perfect fit question tends to transcend gender. And so even though the hope was there, that sense of absolute determination this time wasn't quite there 40 years ago as it was after 40 years, because the sense of excitement about doing it had lasted for 40 years.
Right.
So now we're really going for it. But I think it was really brave on their part. They from one form of profile, my first 5 years were at Bard College, which is wonderful and a great experience. But then I built a PhD program at Emory in South Asian religion, and then I was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Duke. So I was a big university gal in a certain way.
Yeah.
And yet that perfect fit had to do with, I just finished a big ethnography of language learning in Sanskrit and women in India. So I was all about language acquisition and language learning. I'm a creative writer, as you know, and have idolized Breadloaf for many years. And I had given a lecture in the dead of winter at Middlebury in January 2014 on global liberal arts for my graduate student who was teaching there. And the first thing that really blew my mind about Middlebury was I walked into the lecture hall at noon in January at a lecture on global liberal arts, and there were 100 people there. And I thought, at Duke or Emory, wonderful places as they are, you would do something like that and then do like the 10 best kids, who loved liberal arts and wanted to think about it and were in the student government, and that's what you get, and you'd expect that. And then you have this lecture hall of 100 people, and you think, well, this is a magical place.
Yeah.
I did not know the presidency was open, and somebody came up after the lecture and he said, "You're going to be our next president." And I said, "Okay."
It was that simple for the Oval Office.
Oh my goodness, we won't go there.
There was a survey done by the American Council on Education, and it was a survey of the number of presidents, college presidents in the US who are women. And the statistic for 2017 is 30% of college presidents across the country are women. 30%. And when I read that, I was surprised that it said only 30%.
Right.
30% is a hell of a lot better than the corporate sector.
Yes.
What do you think? Only 30%, or do you think 30% is pretty good because it was 10% in 1986?
Yes, so we're 60-40, 55-45, more women now. So I think that's part of it, is that we are educating more women in college. And so the expectation is that ladder, keeps going. I think there are a number of different reasons why I would say that's a real improvement and we could still do better. First is that there is still the drop-off. So it used to be that the drop-off for women was in college, and then it became the drop-off was sort of early career, and now the drop-off for women seems to be mid-career, and we all know the reasons. And I think there are a number of different things. I mean, the first is, I think there still is bias in hiring. Yes, I think mostly unconscious bias, and I'll return to that in a second. I think there is a lack of total commitment to diversity in hiring. So there's a wonderful difference between mentorship and sponsorship that was developed as an idea by a dean of a med school, whom I really like. When I was working in faculty development, I was very interested in this idea of mentor is a wonderful idea, but they're more passive, sort of come to me if you have a problem, I'll tell you how I handled it. A sponsor is, I'm going to take this person of color or this woman or LGBTQI person and actively sponsor them for everything I can think of. You're just like on that person's shoulder and making them, finding opportunities for them as a person who has more power and more authority in a field. And that, I think, is what you also have to do when you hire people, right? And so I think that's what Middlebury did in the end. And so there has to be a passion and a will in a hiring committee. If it feels like an obligation, that diversity isn't going to happen. So I think that's one. I think there's also, the very clear family choices that women make and are forced to make. Still, I think that's absolutely the second reason. And I think the third, back to the bias, I think there's some very interesting ways, and I struggle with this myself, that expectations of women leaders are subtly and not so subtly different. So I'll give an example. I am naturally more of a collaborative leader, and I like bringing everyone together. My myth of leadership is the Dutch horse rescue. In 2006, there were a group of horses on an island, and they were stranded in a storm, and they couldn't get off. A couple of them drowned, they didn't have food, and so there were a lot of folks who were coming with fire engines and throwing food at them, but revving up the fire engines made them even more scared. So then the waters receded a little bit, so they said, we're going to put 4 expert horsewomen on horseback and have them just walk out to the island and say, let's go this way. And the film is utterly inspiring, and you're watching it, and the music is a little schmaltzy in the background, I get that. But you're just watching these 4 horsewomen go out and just gently turn 120 horses, and in this majestic procession they follow, 120 horses follow these 4 horsewomen. That's the kind of leader that I want to be. And it's my myth. When I'm having a bad day, I go back to that video and say 120 horses can follow, And so that is one way to describe that in leadership theory is called post-heroic leadership. And it means that you're not going to be a big heroic person that does top-down. Of course you have to be. Of course you have to be authoritative and you give direction clearly. But all of that is true. But you're not necessarily going to be from on high, right?
More inclusive.
You were doing that, and you do it as much by suggestion, and so on. And because women are already expected to be that way, then sometimes the leadership itself isn't even visible. And that's a very interesting moment. And I've been really struggling with that, because then if you draw attention to all that you've accomplished, then that's very difficult for women. And if you don't, then you're invisible. So you're in this tightrope, all the time, which is kind of interesting. I had a very amazing moment. I was wearing Indian dress for the first time at an honorary degree ceremony. And my staff came up to me. It was in honor of one of my teachers who was getting an honorary degree from Middlebury. And my staff said, Laurie, you have to wear your salwar every day in the office. You look so lovely and it looks so natural on you. And I said, yeah, I wear these all the time when I was in India. Let's see how the weekend goes. I'm not sure I want to come to the office every day, right, in my salwar. And so I was greeting everyone. I greeted everyone as the president. And then I went around to every table to greet them. And right before we were going to get started, so I went up to one table and I said, we're about to get started. I'm hoping you had a great meal, and it's lovely again that you're here. And I had a gentleman look up at me and say, yeah, can I get a cup of coffee? And I stopped and I said, you know, as a waitress, I learned all my administrative skills. I'm happy to tell the kitchen. And he said, and the whole table was like this. And he said, yeah, with cream and sugar. So, but the thing, it was funny, we talked afterwards, he came up, he was mortified, and he said, my table schooled me. He said, I saw you greet everyone as the president, but someone who is ethnically dressed, youngish, that was lovely of him to say. And, you know,
right away.
saying, I hope you had a good meal, we're about to start, that just couldn't be the president. And so, anyway, those are the kinds of visibility things that you have to balance. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I'm trying to.
You've been very good.
Okay.
This salwar, you speaking Hindi, I mean, that's just a tiny little example of your, I was going to say interest, but interest is too mild a word, your passion for India, for South Asia. You know, you grew up on the East Coast, you're a white woman who grew up on the East Coast, very New England upbringing. How did you get so passionate about South Asia, about India?
Right. So the first thing I should say is I grew up in Danvers, Mass, which is Salem Village.
Mm-hmm.
And it just changed its name to Danvers. And Salem City, just nearby, is the site of the American head of the British East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a very early age, my parents, who were very involved with the Peabody Museum and so on in Salem, would take me on exhibits, and they knew the curators of the exhibits, and I got to see the secret stash of beautiful textiles and so forth. Colonialism was not a thing that I learned about until I got to college, but the memories of, you know, what were we doing in Salem trading, you know, and then a beautiful novel that I read, Bharati Mukherjee's The Holder of the World,
Yes.
which is about a passionate embroiderer, which I was when I was growing up, and some wonderful sort of connections from that time. And then in college at Harvard, I was a Celtic Studies minor, religion major and Celtic Studies minor. And people, scholars make connections trying to make sense of a huge jumble of Celtic mythology, Irish and Scottish mythology, and names and grammar, by comparison to early Sanskrit and by comparison to early India. The names of the gods are similar. Some of the grammatical paradigms are similar. And they're similar because they're the two most distant outposts of Indo-European languages. So languages that are more distant but isolated are going to change less and therefore resemble each other, even though they're more isolated, than languages that are mixing at the crossroads of a civilization. So that's what happened with Ireland and India. My final year in college, I wrote my thesis on pilgrimage to sacred water sources in Ireland. And you could, in the 70s and 80s, you could do stuff like this. And then I got a travel fellowship that was like a Watson, but it was Harvard-based, it was called the Sheldon, to go on these pilgrimages that I've written about in Ireland, and then compare them to the pilgrimages to water sources in India. So my year was really a year and a half, a whole year in India, just going on foot on pilgrimages to the source of the Yamuna and the Ganges, the Ganga, and some of the southern rivers, the Kaveri and the Godavari rivers. And it was, I'd never do it again. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was, meaning I never will have the time to devote to something so intense and grand and overwhelming. And you either, when you visit India, you either marry it, and because you love it, or you decide it was fun and go back to
much,
it, or it's overwhelming.
Sensory overload,
Yeah.
you can't deal with it.
Right, but to love a culture at a time when that culture is really coming into its own in a post-colonial way, and to be part of a culture that could be understood as a neo-imperialist culture, that's a tough thing to figure out. So I'm always balancing and thinking in my own scholarship, am I being respectful? Am I romanticizing? Am I unconsciously biased myself? So back to that anxious self-improvement, you know, I feel very strongly that, for instance, when I'm in India, people will ask me, you know, what is the situation of the Indian woman today? And I just say, I ask them, you know, it's not for me to say, and it's important for me not to say, but to listen to other voices. So that, I think, is a constant form of vigilance that's very important. As I mentioned, I just finished a large ethnography of life histories of 90 women who are now teaching the ancient language of Sanskrit. And I sit with them in awe. They have forgotten more Sanskrit than I'll ever know. They are beautiful, brilliant women, and they're the mousy women in the back of libraries that no one knew so much. And sitting with them for 2 or 3 hours, listening to what inspires them, what they read. They have for 3 millennia been prohibited from teaching this language, but in a post-colonial culture, here they are, and because of Sanskrit being part of the humanist idea of India that Gandhi taught, it's so inspiring to be around them. But even there, I'm very clear that I'm not studying them. They're my colleagues and my teachers, and I need to narrate their lives. So it's a different kind of approach in a way. And my favorite, one of the people who I opened this book with, a wonderful woman, young woman, she said, I'd like to interview you because I'm going to start a project on Western women Sanskrit. So I said, oh, that's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah, it's the bridge of the connection.
Yeah.
That way. Yeah. So I think you're an honorary Indian. We can say that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So you're a global citizen, really, but you are American. What does it mean to be an American today?
Oh, yeah. So, what I think about a lot in terms of being an American, and I think a lot about global citizenship, because I think we need to redefine it. I think Middlebury is we're thinking about our next strategic plan, and a lot of people say, okay, well, we get it that global is going to be a pillar, but what is that, right? And everyone says that. So what does it mean to have citizenship? What does that mean about how you think about democracy? What does it mean how you interact with other people? So I'll answer it, I think, in 2 ways. The first is, my father was is a retired cardiovascular surgeon. And I remember from early days, you know, after the trips to the East India Company, and I would come back and he had the Hippocratic Oath right near his bed. And I remember thinking, what would it look like if we had a Hippocratic Oath for education? Where all come, right? And how do we find a way to educate all who are worthy? And sometimes that will be getting to Middlebury, and sometimes it won't be. But I've always been obsessed with the idea of what would it look like for us to have an educational Hippocratic Oath. I feel that I try to live it every day, and I fail, but that what an ideal to have. And so I would say the same thing about democracy, and being an American, which is, how can we live up to the deepest hospitality that America has offered over centuries, in a way that we ourselves are hospitable wherever we are, that we create democratic structures that are hospitable at home, that we are newly hospitable to people whom we murdered before this, like our native populations. I have a very moving moment when, in a creative writing project I was doing, I realized that I was directly descended both from the Native American 10 generations ago that survived the Great Swamp Fire in middle of the 17th century, and descended from the person who was involved in setting the fire that killed so many Native Americans. So, you know, in my person, I had, you know, the inability of our country to be as hospitable as we could be. And so I think a lot about the ethics of hospitality as the foundation for a democratic world. And I think that is the only way to be an American today. And so that would be the first thing I think about. And I think the second is kind of related to that, and that is that when we move about in the world, it's very hard sometimes, I think, if you're from a culture of privilege, to understand how you are perceived. And Americans are sort of extraordinarily unconscious about that. And you see that in India all the time. You're the first time you're a white person, and you're often the only white person around. And so I think becoming newly conscious of how Americans are experienced in the world and doing that every day in your own everyday ethic is also a very important piece of what it should be to be an American.
You spoke there's a video of you speaking to students at a rally on campus, a rally for refugees. And when you addressed the students, a group of very passionate students, you said, we are all here in solidarity with the Muslim Students Association.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me thinking, how do you teach tolerance in the time we live in today? And is that something that can even be taught?
Yeah. So you just made the error of asking a scholar about one of her areas of expertise. So you might glaze over. So I'll try to be short and hopefully inspirational. But so I have a new definition of tolerance. So when I do workshops on new models in the 21st century for interreligious engagement, my model is I begin with the word tolerance and I begin with the word dialogue, and I put a slash through both of them. And everyone looks nervous, like did they sign up for the wrong class and so on. And I say, so when you use a transitive verb, like I tolerate you, Mallika, that's not a very nice thing to say, right? And dialogue is wonderful, but it's not enough. And so for interfaith engagement, we need places of what I call pragmatic pluralism. And I think this can be translated to interracial, interethnic, any number of different places where difference is difficult. We need, in religious terms, we need moments when one religion needs another religion to be itself. Now, what does that mean? It means, let's take 9/11. There was a refrigerator truck that held the remains of the victims. And it was right next to Stern College. And Stern College is a Jewish women's college. And there was a young student there who said, I can't stand it that we're right next to this refrigerator truck. So what we're gonna do is take our little metal chair, sit down next to it, and chant the Shmirot, are the Jewish songs that are chanted in the tradition before, after a person has died and before they're buried. So you're always, you can never leave the remains of someone alone. So if there was a Jewish fingernail in that truck, she was doing it for very Jewish reasons. She was just sitting next to that truck and chanting those songs. And it's a vigil, so you never ever stop. So there were other Jewish women. Yeah. So, and what happened is that Muslims came and listened to her, secular people came and listened to her, Buddhists came, Christians came, everyone came and sat next to her, or whoever was in that chair. So the world, whoever the world was, needed Judaism to be itself. Right. The guardians of the tomb of St. Thomas in South India are Muslims, because the Christian folks around there know, or the church, the holder of the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is a Muslim and has been there for 8 centuries, because Christians are smart enough to realize that if one Christian group, as opposed to another Christian group, had the keys to the most holy site in Christianity, it would be a very difficult time indeed, right? So they know that an outsider needs to take care of them. So Christians need Muslims to be themselves. So I think that that's a model that we need to look for. And in my study of this, these sets of interactions, there are 4 areas where this happens: in times of disaster, in arts, in the guardianship of buildings and tombs, and in food. And so now what I do is ask people, what's your common project with the other person? You can tolerate them, you can dialogue with them, great, but what's your common work? Do you share space with them? So who do you rent out to? Who do you share space with? And if you're not sharing space with people, why not? Who do you cook with? And who do you make art with? And if you ask those really pragmatic questions, you'll find a whole different set of possibilities for how you can work across difference. So that's a very short answer. I have lots more to say, but to your question about how you teach all.
That's beautiful. The anecdote about 9/11 is absolutely, it's so touching.
Yeah.
I could also have many more questions about that, but I am conscious of the time.
Yes.
So I'm going to move on to your poetry.
Yes.
Thank you for sending me the book. Your poetry is absolutely beautiful. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, it is a collection that explores the physical parts of a home, you know, a door, a window, physical parts, but it's very much about the experience of people who come in contact with these parts and how it affects their lives and how it affects their experiences. And I've been thinking for days, how did you get to that point? What was the inspiration? If you could tell us a backstory to this book.
Right. So my first two books of poems, the first was in honoring the Hindu year, and so it was structured by a calendar. And the next was honoring the Jewish year, so also structured by calendar. But I had been in love with this writer, Gaston Bachelard, who was a French philosopher, who was convinced that the structural elements of a home shape our imagination from childhood onwards in ways that we're barely aware of. And I absolutely fell in love with this book. I read it when I was getting my doctorate in Chicago. And I think that things that you can't forget are invitations to poetry, to write poetry. So I kept going back to Bachelard. I kept reading him. I also admired him deeply because before he was a philosopher, he was a mailman. And how he became a philosopher is he just was delivering the mail. And he started to think, and he started to write, and became one of France's great mid-20th century philosophers, which, you know, is a perfect argument for a liberal arts and sciences education, you know, in a certain way. So I thought, what if I just wrote a poetic response to his philosophy and decided that every memory that I have of a structural element of a home could be an occasion for a poem. It was a very scary book to write because my niche was sort of contemplative commentary on religious texts, whether they were in India or in Jewish texts. And so this was a very secular book in many ways. But I have to say I'm delighted because people read it and they understand it. My parents otherwise, you know, pat me on the head and say, oh, I don't know what that book is really about, but we like that you did it. You know?
But well done anyway.
Right, yeah, exactly. And this time they remembered the, you know, corner I was writing about, you know, they knew. I was a little nervous because there's a wonderful column, the Irish writer said that he had a conversation with his mother in which he said, you know, your books are my enemies, because when you have, it's a curse to have a writer in the family, right? And so I thought, are my parents going to be, my family in general, going to be okay with this deeply autobiographical book in a certain way, although everything is fictitious. No poem is actually true. There's always something that makes it more compelling as a poem, but that isn't true, right? But they really enjoyed it, and people are reviewing it in larger venues, and I usually am very,
reviews, yes.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled with that. So I'm a little nervous because my next project is about Buddhism, and I'll be going back to writing poems in Sanskrit, and I'm going back to obscurity, but I have to, you know, you just have to follow your inspiration. But so that was the inspiration for the book. I miss homes. I think we don't mourn homes enough. We don't acknowledge enough how homes can be almost like mothers to us and parents to us. And so I think stating that and writing a sort of poetic tribute to that part of human experience was something that I just felt I had to do.
I have two more quick questions, and I promise we will open it up. I've talked to a few students, current students at Middlebury.
You did some research.
I tried to do some homework.
Yeah.
And the one thing that they said about you is that you're around, you're visible, you're there.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes you drop in at the dining hall and you talk to students. I'm just curious, how do you stay connected with the youth of today? Because I know that you don't have an Instagram account.
Yes, I know, it's so true, I don't have an
It's like,
Instagram.
oh, they're on Instagram, so I
Yes.
wanted to ask you,
Yeah,
how do you stay current with them?
so I try to just talk to them in person.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the best way for me. I forgot to give you my Twitter handle, by the way, so. But I think, so what I've noticed is that students feel more anxious in person-to-person conversation. And I don't want to go down the usual path about millennials,
Right.
because they are dealing with challenges that I never had to, for sure. But I do notice that a mediated world, a world that is more mediated, means that it's not first nature to have a conversation like we're having. It could be, but it tends not to be. Or at least it's a little harder. So I tend to do things, I go on walking meetings everywhere because I get no exercise otherwise, my days are filled.
In the office.
Yeah, and so it's really easy. You just walk around with a person, and it's much better when you're walking together. You get a lot more thinking done. And then I see everyone on campus. So walking meetings are the best, and they're the only way you could even mildly not gain 50 more pounds, because you're eating for Middlebury all the time, and you're in meetings all day. So, so that is something that I really love to do. I also just show up where they are. And if you do that enough, then everyone just accepts that you're there. And they find it very easy to talk to you because you're just part of the landscape. Oh, that's the president.
Right.
And it's nice to be that.
It removes a formality, they're not
It does.
intimidated.
They respond sometimes to the role. But then I say, look, you could tell, you're a really smart person, you got into Middlebury, you can tell from looking at me for 2 seconds, I'm not a scary person. I think sometimes they wish I were scarier because then they could rebel more against me, but they don't know what to do with me sometimes, But that's part of the leadership style difference, that is hard for people to see. But the other thing that happens a lot is with open office hours, people come with the most random things. They come with projects. My favorite office hour conversation with a Middlebury student that I will never forget is she said, I am so interested in putting together environmentalism and architectural design. I said, fantastic. She said, I'm really interested in drains. I said, great. Drains.
All enthusiasm.
Yes. And I thought about like the Muslim and the Indus Valley, beautiful, water transportation systems that are beautiful. And so we talked about that for a little. She said, the most important things about drains is to make them aesthetically pleasing. I said, go mid. This is exactly right. This is so true. And lo and behold, you walk around campus the next, after she did her senior project, and all the little drain things had these beautiful little sculptures around them and gardens and little signs that showed why you were doing it this way and what a rain garden was, and it was fantastic. So that's what happens when you just hang out, and you have to be completely unafraid that someone will come up to you who's mad at you for a decision you made, and you inevitably will make a decision that will make people angry. And they are gonna, do their thing. And that is also part of what it means to be sort of out and about on campus.
And you show up at games,
Yes,
and you take your dogs to the games,
Yes.
every time they come, you win.
yes, that is the
The track record still holds.
So what it actually is, it's like the 50% of people married to each other at Middlebury, the actual statistic is 20%. Someone did do a study, so it is 20%. So the actual thing about the 2 Great Pyrenees, they are big white dogs, and they also really work when you're wandering around campus. People are scared of you, they're totally not scared of the big white sofa-looking dog that you can lean against and so on. So it's very nice. But the idea is if you're behind one goal and Suka shows up on the field, then you'll come from behind. She can't guarantee a win, but she can guarantee that
one more goal.
Surge of coming from behind. That's what she does, yeah. That's exactly
Well, I can hope you continue to have that. Good luck.
Thank you. Yes.
Great, guys, it's over to you. Any questions?
Hi.
I'm from Hong Kong International School, and we had talked earlier about your work, your translation work, and especially the Gita. And I was going to ask you if that work and work with the Gita over the years, how that's influenced your life.
Thank you for that question. So I will tell you a hilarious story in which I realized how one project in life is to just become less and less hypocritical, and to be less of a hypocrite when you die than when you were an adult, right? So the reason why I begin my answer that way is that I was really, really anxious about how people were going to perceive and receive my translation of the Gita. And this text is about not being anxious about the fruits of your actions. And here I was, anxious about how people were going to receive the Gita. And someone gently pointed that out to me, that I might want to just take my own, lesson a little bit. So that was a great moment. So I think in general, I would say the following: I couldn't do administrative work as a kind of path of self-improvement, or a spiritual path, if you will, if I hadn't translated the Gita. Because the lesson of it is to literally not cling to the results of your actions and just do them for the right reasons. There are many other things that the Gita teaches, but that's the basic one. And that's a lesson that you have to learn, and a teaching that you have to remind yourself of every day. Because when you're in a very complex community, and as we were just talking about, you have to make decisions that are never going to please everyone. You know that you're going to annoy some people just by being who you are. All of those things can never affect you, or if they affect you, they need to affect you for 1 second. And then you move on, because your job is to do the right thing. And to develop as much compassion for people as you can, and to be as present for people as you can. So on the days when I think I've failed as a president, it's because I'm not present to people. It's too much, I'm doing too many things, I'm annoyed with the thing that the person said to me. Pettiness is something that really bothers me, and so I will let myself get distracted by pettiness. And so I'm not in a Gita moment, but then I'll go back to my favorite chapter, is the second chapter, and think about the idea of reacting equally to a large thing and a small thing. And I can get very sanctimonious about other people's sanctimoniousness, right? And that's not, also I bring myself back to saying that's not what the Gita teaches. So I would say I wouldn't have had the courage to do this kind of work if it weren't for the Gita. I've also used it, I used to do workshops on how the Gita can help you get through med school. And people, it was quite serious. And it was all about, sort of being in a composed way and in a meditative way, responding equally to life and death for people who are preparing to go to med school. And it's really helped me teach students to prepare for life as well. So that would be the main answer.
There's one here.
There's one there and then one here.
You describe your days as being filled, and you describe yourself as being anxious, driven, and inspired.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there's a natural inclination towards a poetic life,
Yes.
towards poetry. But can you tell us a little bit about how you find the time, and more importantly, the space for poetry in your busy life?
Yes. So there are days when I think if I had true courage, I would just be a writer, nothing else. But then I like people, and I like running things, and I love really good business processes, and I'm sort of doomed, to be a president. So, and I love the work. There's nothing like it. But I think if you're in high executive function all the time, and you govern out of love, I have a big conversation with many people about whether you can actually govern out of love. I try to. You are exhausted sometimes. I mean, you're giving so much of yourself, right? And you're in high executive function all the time. So that was a good description. So the poetry for me is very easy in a certain way because it's a balance. It moves you away from all of that into a more contemplative space. And it's also the poem, my inspiration are the symbolist traditions, both in France and in England, and the Vedic tradition, which when I translate early Sanskrit hymns, I translate them very, very simply because the language is actually quite simple. It's gorgeous, but it's very simple. And so it's doable, right? I have an unpublished, very complex novel, which is finished and not very good. But I have room in my head for one big administrative project, and that is running a college at the moment. And so I put that novel in the drawer, typical thing, professor, that's got the novel in the drawer. But the poetry just keeps coming because, first of all, we have this incredible thing called Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conference and Breadloaf Translators Conference and Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference and the campus. So I'm surrounded by writers who somehow have the generosity of spirit to say, hey, let's talk. And so I have that and poets who were extraordinary. So every morning I get up around 5:30, meditate, write from 6 to 7, and start being president around 7:30. So it's very straightforward, and it's even if nothing emerges that day except changing a word, it's a discipline. There is absolutely no compromise on it. And sometimes if I have 20 minutes, I'll just go and work on a poem. And it's a deeply balancing act for me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does, thank you.
I was curious whether you had a writing ritual, and that just answered it.
Yeah,
The discipline of
absolutely.
doing it every morning.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. And working in 5-minute increments, people do that, and it is a skill that you have to develop. Yeah, for sure. I think there was a hand.
Yeah.
Hi.
Diverting a little bit from poetry, and I hate to because that's fascinating, but a little bit back, not just the Gita, but the languages.
Yeah.
Because that's a very important part of the Middlebury education. It is originally probably the preeminent
Yes.
school in many ways in that area. What role do you think that language study plays in the liberal arts education, especially at Middlebury? And has it changed with the mentioned millennials, with this generation in terms of teaching and an approach to it?
You're Mike, right?
I'm Mark.
Mark,
Yeah.
sorry, thanks. And I just want to say you're from Carl?
I'm from Carl.
I just have to tell you guys, how cool is this? I mean, I want to say Middlebury is the kind of place that attracts people like Mark. He's from Carleton and he just really believes in liberal arts and that's why he's here. So I'm so glad you're here. So many interesting things to say. You just made the error of asking a college administrator about their area of expertise, right? So let me just share some cool things about the Middlebury language schools today. The first is that while most other places language enrollments are going down in the United States, Middlebury can't find enough beds for all of its language schools. Why? It's probably a bad reason, right? Which is that everybody's giving up and so everyone's coming to Middlebury, right? I think that is in fact true. I think it's called brand selection. So that's great for us, and we could expand to even more. I think in different campuses. Half of our or 3 of our languages are taught out at Mills College, and just because it's a campus that would be great to. They offered and they have a lovely campus. The rest are in Vermont in the summer. So that's the first interesting factoid. The second is that our ages for languages are trending younger. So people who are enrolling in our language schools are now just out of college. And so what we're also seeing, back to anxiety, is a lot more mental health issues, a lot more questions around harassment. I'm kind of proud because they're managing these in language, because remember the language pledge, right? If you speak English, you get a warning, but if you do it more than twice, you will be asked to leave. And so it's an extraordinarily rigorous commitment. And questions of identity are still very present for someone who's 23 or 24. And that's very different than someone who's 50 who wants to move into a new market, right? So we're seeing, we're having a lot more challenges in that regard in our summer schools because our ages are trending younger. The third thing that's really interesting for us in the language schools is we're noticing changes in Asian languages in particular in why people come. So the Japanese school, most everyone came to the Japanese school in the 80s and 90s to learn Japanese because of business, and mostly in the 80s. And then now they're mostly literature students because of anime, literature and film. So that's a really interesting switch of why people study languages. And you'll see similar things only in reverse. More people now who want to study French and German are interested in business relationships than they are necessarily in French and German literature. I think that those are the trends that we're seeing in 2018. What I would also say is that I get asked a lot about what about Rosetta Stone, what about taking your phone and just doing your thing, and all of that is absolutely happening. But what's interesting is even language translation with AI needs humans to track changes in conventional language use. And so what we're seeing even with our graduates at Monterey, who are translation and interpretation experts, and that's another big part of the new Middlebury landscape, is we now have a graduate school in policy in Monterey that also trains people in languages in really wonderful ways, and trains people in translation and interpretation, which is a deeply extraordinary skill, and I would say it's a deeply spiritual skill myself. Talk about peace building every day. But what we're seeing in that space is more people getting more jobs in language because you need more people to maintain the computational language platforms. So it's actually created more jobs in for language experts rather than less, which is a great thing. I'm painting a rosy picture because I deeply believe in this. And I think Middlebury is lucky and honored and privileged to be a kind of place that stays true to its mission. It started the German school. Middlebury does things for the right reason, and then it thrives. If it tries to do things to keep up with the next liberal arts college, it's never going to work. So it decided to do a German school. The first language school was the German school in 1915. Remember what was happening in 1915, right? So it was an amazing moment, and it did it for the right reason, and then came French, and then the rest. And so I think we have been really building bridges and making peace through language while nations have risen and fallen for over 100 years. So I kind of like the model. I think it continues to work. I think people need other people to learn language, and they're not distracted by the culture. They just have and that's wonderful, and that's another way to engage. My favorite motto, I'll end with this, is there are 3 ways to learn a language. One is to fall in love with someone, and that's always fun. Another is to be in a life or death situation. My husband learned his Hebrew jumping out of helicopters in the Israeli army, and he had to just know that Hebrew. And the third is Middlebury. Absolutely, it was delightful. I also want to thank Lakshmi and Gokul and Alice for the hosting. It was a beautiful event. And Mallika, you're like my new best friend.
I think there's one more question.
Oh, there we go.
Is that all right?
Hi.
Hi, sorry, hi. I'm Middlebury class of 2012, and yeah. When I was there, Middlebury definitely prided itself on its inclusiveness, diversity, the language schools, international students, and really being a place where students of color, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds really thrived. With that being said, there was that recent event that kind of put Middlebury into the national spotlight in more negative sense, which was the Charles Murray protests.
Yes.
And I guess my question, being able to speak to you, which I find fascinating, is how you were able to navigate those waters, because they're so deep and sensitive and important to people, and how you as a leader of a liberal arts and sciences college chose to, I guess, address that, and what impact that had on the college thereafter.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. So I'll begin by saying it was the most difficult moment in my career, bar none. And I think one of the most difficult moments for Middlebury. I would say a couple of things. When I started in my inaugural address, I talked about having more and better arguments with greater respect, deeper resilience, and deeper wisdom. And I meant that. I think I've thought a lot about the events, thought a lot about how we respond to it. I think there were a number of different factors that came into play. Murray came to speak in 2007 on the thing that people were most upset about. But the response was, it was painful, but it wasn't, it was the year before you started, right? It would have been, yeah. But it wasn't as painful as right after the election. And I think that was the number one thing that kind of created that really difficult spark in that moment. Also, Middlebury is a very open campus, and we were not prepared for outside folks coming in. And that was a big part of it. We are now, I tell you. I've become an expert in emergency preparedness. But the other thing that was so important for me to learn was I grew up in, Salem Village, where there was a kind of utopian small town, and I think sometimes small liberal arts colleges that are really good have almost utopian expectations, and at the same time, really good that's true. So I spent, back to what Mallika asked me before, I spent a lot of time with the protesters afterwards. It was very emotional. I would say, look, I openly disagreed with the speaker in front of you. I told you that you had a right to protest, and I read you the policy one more time, and I told you you belonged here, which was the argument that they had with his person, not with the work he was coming to discuss, which was about class. And still this happened, and their response was, this was our home, right? And so that's a debate of what is a college? Is it a residence or is it a home? And a college like Middlebury, which the way our students talk about it is total intimacy, right? Is that you could cross the street and you would be in your residence, one place, your home, and the next place you're at a really big public square where you have to perform. So I think that we hadn't, as a college, spent the time that we needed to in the last several decades really coming to terms with what diversity meant in the second whitest state in the United States, right? And so I think it was also a moment when the college just needed to go, we have to deal with this, we have to come to terms with this. And I think that it was, on the one hand, a really painful moment. On the other hand, what's happened afterwards has deeply inspired me, and so I'll share that with you as well. My first instinct as someone who's trained in conflict mediation was to fix it and to go everywhere, and I did. I spent more time outside with people. It was very painful. Sometimes there were people who were really mad, and from both sides. There were people who thought that we should have completely forgiven all the protesters. We shouldn't have held them accountable at all. And there were other people who thought that we should have kicked them all out. And both sides of the extremes were really mad. And experiencing that as the sort of person in the middle who was responsible for the college was very intense. But I stayed just connected and always out on campus as much as I could. No matter, some days I was like, whoa, I don't want to do this, and then I did. But students and faculty, I realized that I had to let students and faculty figure it out and step back. And so they created the commissioned to work on our values for 2018. They created the statements about diversity and inclusion and inclusive excellence. And I needed to let them do that, and that was very, very important. There are a lot of calls on a lot of campuses to adopt the Chicago principles, and I get that, and we also had our own statement. What we said instead is we're gonna have put the people who disagree in the room and make them stay there because they disagree well, people who have reputation, students, faculty. So the year after, it's been 2 years now, and I'm kind of blown away by how far we've come. The year after we had PEN America, which is the writing, people who really get multicultural questions in 2018 and get freedom of expression issues. They came to be with us. We had a number of other folks come to be with us who really wanted to help us, and we wanted to work with them to figure out the Middlebury way. And so now we have a faculty statement on dignity and freedom of expression and respect for difference. We have really amazing student organizations that work across difference, whose point is to host events, to work across difference. We've had, last year, I think we had 9 controversial speakers, and it's like, I look around going, we've had more than any of the other NASCARs. Because we're saying, no, we're gonna show that we can do this in a new way, and be welcoming, as inclusive as we possibly can be in the midst of that. And that's the thing, is who are we not including, and how do we keep expanding that public sphere? And so there is threefold way forward, and I've written about this in a couple of places. The first is informal events. We have these things called pop-up debate cafes where someone says, okay, we're gonna have this really controversial topic and go at this dining hall and that place and go talk. And they do. The second is more formal events. We just had Frank Rooney last night. And it was big speakers, but we've changed our format. Anyone can come, anyone can speak, but we say to the speaker, you're talking for about a half hour, and then we're all gathered in small groups and we're gonna talk about what you just said, and then we're gonna interact with you. So our purpose in listening to you is not just to sit and listen, but to actually turn to each other and talk about what you just said and process. So we're learning, and you're learning too, speaker, right? And so that is new, and that's really working well. So those are the formal things. We have a series called Critical Conversations where we have far left. Far right is not really far right, but certainly strong Republican folks. That's worked really well. And the third thing is, because of our leadership in this area, we have received an $850 million grant from Mellon to train faculty, take them out of the classroom and train them together on developing diversity of viewpoint in the classroom and strength in that. And so part of what we're doing is asking each professor how much, and asking students to evaluate professors on how they are helping with diversity of viewpoint in the classroom. And that's gonna look different for the constitutional law person or the person who teaches European history, right, than the person who teaches American education, et cetera. And so that's really powerful for us. So that threefold stool, diversity of viewpoint in the classroom and training faculty and having faculty find a Middlebury way that's real, that they're proud of. Second, informal, and third, formal. That's the threefold stool that seems to work. The other thing, 2 other things that have just blown me away how they've transformed our campus. One is that we have put in restorative practices. That is, we have 100 people now trained in this practice. It's like restorative justice, but when something goes wrong, we have people sit in a circle who were involved, both the harmer and the harmed, and they speak about the impact of what happened in their lives. And so it's a community taking responsibility, looking at each other to when something hurts. And that doesn't take care of all of it by a long shot, but it really has transformed the way individual things that happen on campus where people of color feel marginalized are able to say to the person, actually, that hurt, and this is why this had an impact. Because what it means to be politically aware is to be aware of one's impact without even knowing, why or how, to be aware of one's impact. And then the other thing we have is a trainer. So we hired someone, we thought, we're an athletic school, teams have trainers, we need someone, whenever something goes bad, we don't need just a chief diversity officer, which we also have now, excellence and inclusion is the term that I prefer. We have someone, when something goes bad, this person comes in and works with everyone and trains them on how to think about diversity in new ways and inclusive excellence. Our first example, her first day on campus, our posse students, who are from, most of them are students of color, were really excited about getting a picnic, and they went to the dining hall and they were taking stuff to build the picnic, and the white working class Vermont dining hall worker said, "This isn't a grocery store, you know," and you can imagine how that felt. And so her first day, Renee, she's fantastic, was training the students of color from the posse group that had stayed over the summer and the white working class dining hall workers, right there. That is America difference right there. So we have a trainer, we're really excited, like, oh my God, let's work with this. And we have restorative practices. And it's only been a year, and the difference on campus, I'm just like in love with Middlebury all over again, because we've really thrived. Something could blow up tomorrow, so let's be clear. You know, we're in that space right now. But we've worked really hard, and I would say with our heart and soul, to really find our way forward in this new way. So that's a long answer, but I deserve a long answer.
Do we have time for one more?
Okay, can it be really quick, we're worried.
Can I
Just
Quickly.
Laurie, since you're here, I really want to ask you about your opinion on international business education.
International business
Business
education,
education.
yes,
Yeah, since
yes.
I am from Seattle coast of Middlebury
Monterey,
Institute, I got my international MBA.
yes.
And me and many of my classmates, we went on to work for, Silicon Valley companies,
Yes.
Apple, Facebook, Google, and I work for Adobe. And I've been in international business, growing Adobe software products all over the world. And so are many of my classmates. So today we have a strong network of all these multinational experts, right? But like 2 years ago, they decided to discontinue this
Yes.
program. That's very sad.
Yes.
Why is that?
Yes, so that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So, first of all, like, total cool resource, precious gem sitting there who just asked that question. And I would say, first of all, how proud I am of the Monterey grads. They're incredible. And so I think that our international business legacy is phenomenal, particularly for Monterey. And I want to make sure that that legacy remains intact. And so I would say, A, I support it, it's fantastic. B, what we were really facing was the enrollments were small, and the professors and the cost of running that program was so large that it just didn't make financial sense anymore. So it was a really painful decision that we had to make. But what we wanted to do, and we now have a wonderful new dean who is working on how do we continue that legacy. So what we're hoping to do is, and we've actually put in place, because we're still in the midst of teaching that degree out, is we are putting in place a series of modules that will essentially be like Masters of Business Arts, so that we still will be able to offer all the skills that someone with an MBA had. That moment that we made the decision also had to do with accreditation. So the MBA accreditors say you're going to need to hire 6 more people in order to keep at the level of accreditation. And I thought, given that we're already struggling financially and we can't hire 6 more people, that was one of those tough decisions that had to be made. But I'm really proud. We have our MBA students and our students still go to the business case at Davos, and they always win. They're like incredible, creative people. And I really want to continue that legacy in as many different ways as I can. So.
You really have to wrap
Okay.
up, and I want to thank our wonderful speaker and moderator, and thank all of you for being here. And truly, I caught the last half hour of it, and truly inspired me. And you are right. I look forward to coming to work every day, but I think it sounds like you're equally passionate
Yes.
about walking the campus of Middlebury. And thank you for being here and being such an inspiration. And thank you, Monica, for being here. And this is our wonderful catalog, which
Okay.
sorry, the show closed January 6th, but the catalog also sold out, but we served 2 copies. This is a wonderful Chinese artist, Heidi Liang in Paris, and she was a wonderful pioneer, and we want to share the catalog with you. And thank you for being here, and we look forward to our future opportunity
I would
of
love to do
welcoming you
that.
back. And with us in March, and again, have a wonderful evening, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, everybody.